The night was still. There was an eerie quiet in the air, a silence broken only by the distant hum of crickets. It was a night like any other in a sleepy suburban neighborhood until the phone call. The sound of the receiver being lifted from its cradle echoed through the small kitchen. The harsh glow of the overhead light illuminated the blood-stained walls, casting long shadows over the body that lay crumpled on the floor. Jennifer Hayes sat there, her knees drawn up to her chest, a strange stillness in her posture. Her clothes, once a bright shade of yellow, were now drenched in dark crimson. Her hands, stained with blood, rested lifelessly in her lap. The knife that had ended so many lives lay beside her, its blade still reflecting the harsh light. Jennifer's eyes were vacant, as if she had disconnected herself from everything around her, her surroundings, her actions, her past. Her mind had entered a realm of numbness, where the weight of what had just transpired was too much to comprehend. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She simply waited. There was nothing left to do now but face the consequences. She reached for the phone. The dial tone hummed in her ear, and the seconds felt like minutes, stretching into an eternity. Finally, the call connected, the voice on the other end of the line sharp and professional, cutting through the fog of Jennifer's mind. 911, what's your emergency? Jennifer hesitated, her fingers gripping the receiver so tightly her knuckles whitened. The words were stuck in her throat. For a moment, she felt as though the voice on the other end wasn't even real. The reality of what she had done still seemed so distant, so impossible. Could this really be happening? I killed them, she whispered, her voice a broken thread, barely audible. The dispatcher was silent for a moment. There was no immediate response. It seemed as though the weight of Jennifer's words had caught the dispatcher off guard. The tone on the other end of the line was no longer routine. There was a shift, a slight change in the way she spoke, now laced with a hint of urgency. Ma'am, can you repeat that? The dispatcher's voice was steady but cautious. Jennifer took a shaky breath, the gravity of what she had done sinking deeper into her chest. She closed her eyes, a shudder running through her body, but there was no turning back now. She had already crossed the line. I killed them all, Jennifer repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was a chilling finality to it. No hesitation. No remorse. Just a statement of fact. The dispatcher's voice, now tinged with disbelief, rose in volume slightly as she tried to process the gravity of the situation. Ma'am, who did you kill? Are you in danger? Can you tell me your location? Jennifer didn't answer right away. Her eyes fell to the blood-stained kitchen floor, where the bodies of 6 men, including her own husband, lay lifeless. She had no words for the dispatcher. She had no explanation for what had happened. All she knew was that she had finally reached the end of a long, torturous road. No, Jennifer responded finally, her voice flat. Not anymore. She gave the dispatcher the address with a soft sigh, the weight of each word like a leaden stone sinking deeper in her chest. The dispatcher quickly repeated the details and hung up the phone, the faint click echoing in the silence of the kitchen. Jennifer lowered the receiver slowly, her hands trembling slightly, the shock of the moment finally starting to settle into her bones. She had done it. She had taken their lives, but at what cost? She felt numb, almost detached from her own body. What had driven her to this point? Was it love? Was it betrayal? Was it revenge? Or all three? Whatever the reason, she no longer cared. It was over. The shrill sound of sirens broke the silence, growing louder as they neared. Flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows through the windows of the kitchen, turning the blood-stained walls into a twisted canvas of flashing colors. The sound of the sirens seemed to come from another world, from another life, one that Jennifer no longer inhabited. She remained seated, unmoving. The sirens grew louder. The police were almost there. But Jennifer didn't rise to meet them. She didn't flinch. She simply sat there, staring ahead, waiting. Waiting for the moment when the world would finally come to collect her, when the consequences of her actions would come crashing down on her. She closed her eyes. When the police arrived, the scene they walked into was one of utter chaos, a scene so violent and disordered it was as though it had come straight out of a nightmare. There was no sign of a struggle. No broken furniture. No signs that the violence had been anything but deliberate. Jennifer's husband, Jon, lay at her feet, a single gunshot wound to his chest, and his eyes wide open, frozen in a look of shock. His friends, the men who had orchestrated the horrible situation that had led them all to this point, were scattered around the kitchen, each one lifeless, their eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The officers had expected something grisly. They had expected violence. But nothing could prepare them for the stillness that greeted them. Jennifer sat on the cold tile floor, unmoving. Her hands, stained with blood, were resting gently in her lap, and the knife that had caused so much carnage lay beside her, gleaming in the dim light. The officers immediately rushed into the room, weapons drawn, shouting commands as they took in the horrifying scene. Their eyes scanned the room, landing on Jennifer, who still hadn't moved. A cold chill passed through the officers as they realized that the woman sitting before them was no longer the person they had once known, if they had ever known her at all. "Hands where we can see them," one of the officers shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. Jennifer lifted her hands slowly, her movements deliberate, almost languid. She made no attempt to resist. She made no attempt to run. She was already beyond that point. Her fate had already been sealed. She was no longer a woman filled with fear or regret, she was simply a shell, a person who had done what she needed to do. A few of the officers exchanged quick glances. One of them, clearly rattled, muttered a curse under his breath. "Jesus Christ." Another officer stepped forward, cautiously approaching Jennifer, his voice softer but still firm. "Ma'am, put the knife down. You don't need this anymore." Jennifer blinked, as though she had forgotten that the knife was still in her lap. Her hands shook slightly as she placed the blade down on the floor beside her. She slid it away from herself with a slow, deliberate motion, almost as though she were performing a ritual, a final act of surrender. The officers moved quickly, grabbing her arms and pulling her to her feet. She didn't resist. She didn't scream. She simply stood there, her face pale and empty, as they cuffed her wrists. They were cold against her skin, but she barely noticed. "You're under arrest for multiple homicides," one of the officers said, reading her rights as they led her toward the door. Jennifer didn't look back. She didn't care to. She had already left that life behind her. As she was escorted out of the house, she cast one final glance over her shoulder, toward the kitchen where her husband's body lay. The bodies of the other men. The blood. The horror. Her eyes closed for a moment, and then she exhaled. It was over. The media descended upon the case almost immediately. Jennifer Hayes' story was too shocking, too incredible to ignore. Headlines screamed of betrayal and revenge and housewife turns killer, plastering her face across every news outlet. The public's fascination with her crime was immediate, their disgust and sympathy clashing in equal measure. Her trial became a media circus. People speculated about her motive, about her actions. Was she simply a victim of circumstance? Or was she something more sinister? As Jennifer sat silently in the courtroom, her face a mask of cold detachment, the world watched. And as the trial continued, the story of Jennifer Hayes would unfold layer by layer, revealing the betrayal that had led her to this point. But Jennifer had already made her choice. She was done with the lies. Done with the pretending. Now, it was time to face the truth. Jennifer had once believed in love. She had once believed in the kind of love that filled every corner of the heart, the kind of love you read about in books, watched in movies, and dreamed about on quiet nights. The kind of love where promises are made, dreams are shared, and the future is bright. She had known that love, once upon a time. It had started innocently enough. Jennifer first met Jon Hayes in high school, in the midst of the chaos of adolescence. Jon was everything she could have ever dreamed of: charming, charismatic, the kind of guy who could make you feel like you were the only person in the world. He had that rare confidence, that sparkle in his eyes, and that ability to make anyone feel important. He wasn't just popular, he was magnetic. And Jennifer, a quiet, sweet girl who spent more time with books than with people, was drawn to him like a moth to a flame. They became inseparable. To Jennifer, Jon was the world. They shared their hopes and dreams, their plans for the future, and the promise of a life together. They talked about marriage, about building a home, about growing old together. It was all so perfect, so simple, so right. They got married young, barely out of their teens, but full of belief in the future and in each other. It was the kind of love everyone around them admired. But as anyone who has been in love long enough knows, the road to happily ever after isn't as smooth as it seems. Over time, the cracks began to appear. It started small at first. Jon would gamble a little here and there, just for fun. Jennifer didn't mind much. After all, it wasn't anything serious. It was just the occasional game of poker with friends, or a quick bet on a football game. Jon would laugh it off, saying it was all in good fun. "Don't worry, babe," he would tell her. "I've got it under control." But over time, the bets grew bigger. The stakes became higher. Jennifer watched as Jon's charming demeanor began to fade, replaced by a desperation she didn't recognize. It wasn't just a game anymore. It was an addiction. Jennifer tried to hold on to the man she had married, the man who had once been her everything. But the man who had been full of dreams and plans was slipping away. The house that had once been filled with laughter and love began to feel like a place of tension. The bills piled up. The overdue notices came more frequently, and the phone calls from creditors were endless. She could feel the weight of it all: Jon's obsession with the gamble, the deepening pit of debt, the dread in the air every time the doorbell rang or the phone rang. It wasn't just the money that was being drained. It was her heart, her trust, her belief in the man she had once loved with all her soul. She watched helplessly as Jon's face grew more gaunt, his eyes more hollow, and his temper more volatile. The man she had married, the man she had believed in, was no longer the same person. She didn't know how to fix him, how to save them, how to make him see that this addiction was going to destroy everything they had built. And then, one evening, there was a knock on their door. Jennifer had been sitting at the kitchen table, her hands resting on a stack of unopened bills. The weight of it all was beginning to break her down. Jon had promised things would get better, but Jennifer had heard that same line so many times before. She knew, deep down, it wasn't true. She was already standing up, ready to gather the strength to face whatever came next. She had already lived through so many sleepless nights, so many angry arguments, so much heartache. But nothing had prepared her for what came next. Jon opened the door, and before Jennifer could say a word, she felt the cold, oppressive presence of a stranger entering their home. His name was Anthony Romano, a man whose reputation preceded him. Jennifer didn't know much about Anthony, except for the whispers she had heard. He wasn't someone you crossed, someone you made enemies of. He was a man who lived in the shadows, and when he made a deal, there were no second chances. Anthony's eyes were cold, his voice even colder. He didn't greet Jon with a handshake or even a polite introduction. He came straight to the point. "You owe me," he said, his words like a threat wrapped in a smooth, calm tone. "And you know what happens when debts aren't paid." Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine, a feeling of dread creeping up on her. She tried to ignore the panic rising in her chest, tried to calm the knot of fear that tightened in her stomach. But she could feel the tension in the air. It was thick, suffocating. She glanced at Jon, looking for some sign of reassurance, but he was already avoiding her gaze. He was shaking. His shoulders hunched as though he were preparing for a storm. Anthony didn't give them a chance to explain, didn't allow for a moment of pause. Instead, he laid out the deal in the simplest terms, in a way that made Jennifer's heart stop beating. "You're going to make things right," Anthony said to Jon, his voice icy, devoid of any empathy. "And you're going to do it tonight." Jennifer's world began to spin. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How had they gotten to this point? How had Jon's gambling addiction led them to a place where they were dealing with people like Anthony? What had happened to the man she had once married, the man who had promised her a future, the man who had made her believe that they were invincible together? But Anthony wasn't here to talk. He didn't want excuses. He didn't care about the debts or the reasons behind them. His focus was singular: payment. And payment wasn't going to come in the form of cash. Payment was going to come in the form of Jennifer. Jennifer's stomach lurched, the words ringing in her ears as though they were spoken by someone else, someone far away. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Couldn't believe what was happening. How could Jon, her husband, the man she had promised to love and honor, do this? How could he agree to something so vile, so disgusting, so wrong? But Jon didn't speak. He didn't try to defend her. Instead, he stood there, staring at the floor, his face flushed with shame, his lips trembling. His silence said everything. Jennifer's heart shattered in that moment, the weight of Jon's betrayal crushing her chest. He had sold her. He had given her away to a man like Anthony, someone who would treat her like an object, a pawn in a game she had never wanted to play. The reality of their situation hit her like a tidal wave, and all she could do was stand there in disbelief. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But there was nowhere to go. There was no escape. That night, Jennifer sat in her room, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. Jon's betrayal felt like a weight so heavy it could crush her entire being. She couldn't fathom what he had done, what he had agreed to. She had trusted him. She had loved him. But now, she was nothing more than a commodity in the eyes of the man she had married. Jennifer felt a darkness settle over her. It was a cold, hollow feeling that began to creep in, filling her up from the inside. She couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't take back the crushing blow of Jon's betrayal. But there was one thing she could do. There was one thing that, in the twisted, broken world they had found themselves in, made sense. Jennifer would do whatever it took to survive. Jennifer never saw it coming. It had been weeks since Anthony's visit, and though Jennifer tried to keep the facade of a normal life, the tension in the house was unbearable. The weight of their mounting debts, Jon's gambling addiction, and Anthony's looming presence weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had tried to pretend everything was fine, to cling to the hope that this nightmare would eventually pass. But deep down, Jennifer knew that their lives had already spiraled into a place from which there was no return. Jon, once the man she had fallen in love with, the confident, caring husband, had changed. He had become a ghost of the person he used to be. The charm he had once wielded so effortlessly was gone, replaced by a constant sense of anxiety and dread. He avoided her eyes, his silence deafening as it stretched across their dinners and conversations. Jennifer had asked him about the dead, about Anthony's threats, but Jon always deflected, always insisted that everything would be fine. But everything wasn't fine. Jennifer knew that. The bills kept piling up, and the unanswered phone calls from unknown numbers only added to her fear. She knew that the monsters Jon owed were not the kind who gave second chances. They weren't the kind who could be reasoned with. Still, Jennifer clung to the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this would all blow over. But the night Jon sat her down, his hands trembling as though he were about to deliver a death sentence, her world shattered. The house was quiet, too quiet, and Jon's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was barely a whisper. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, his head hanging low, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Jennifer watched him, her heart already racing with the fear of knowing something was terribly wrong. She wanted to ask him what was going on, to beg him to explain what had been eating away at him for so long, but the words caught in her throat. She had a feeling she already knew the answer. Jon cleared his throat, and the air seemed to grow heavier around them. His voice, when he spoke, was strained, as if each word was a weight he could hardly bear. "Jen, there's something I need to tell you." Jennifer's heart sank. She couldn't breathe. The blood drained from her face as she waited for him to continue. She was afraid to hear the words that would leave his mouth, but she knew she had no choice but to listen. Jon hesitated for a moment, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it was the only thing holding him upright. His eyes were red, filled with tears that he tried to hide. The man who had once been so full of life now seemed broken, lost in a world of his own making. Jennifer listened in stunned silence as Jon explained everything: the money, the growing debt, the never-ending cycle of gambling that had led them to this point. The shame and guilt that had been gnawing at him now spilled out in a torrent of words. "We're in too deep," Jon said, his voice cracking. I owe more than I can pay, Jen. It's more than just the money, it's the people I'm involved with. People who don't forgive. People who will do anything to get what they're owed." Jennifer felt the cold sweat on her skin as she listened. The fear in Jon's voice sent a chill through her bones. She had known things were bad, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. Jon's eyes met hers, his face full of guilt and desperation. "The money, it's not just a few $1,000s, Jen," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I owe them tens of thousands. And they're not going to stop until it's paid. I didn't know what else to do. They've given me an ultimatum." Jennifer felt the floor beneath her feet tilt as Jon's words struck her like a punch to the gut. Jon's eyes darted around, as if he were searching for a way out, a way to take it all back. But there was no escape. He knew that now. The damage had been done, and all they could do was face the consequences. I didn't have a choice, Jon continued. Jen, they're not asking for money anymore. They're asking for you. The world around Jennifer seemed to stop. The air grew thick, suffocating. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her body went numb as her mind tried to process what Jon had just said. They want me. Jennifer's voice cracked. The words barely left her mouth, but they carried a weight that threatened to crush her. Jon nodded, his face pale with fear. Yes. Anthony, he said it would be the only way to settle the debt. You're the payment, Jen. They're taking you. Jennifer's mind raced, her heart pounded in her chest like a drum. She couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. Tears welled in her eyes, but she couldn't make sense of the emotions that flooded through her. Rage, betrayal, terror, despair, each one battled for dominance within her. How could Jon do this to her? How could he offer her up like a piece of property, a pawn to save himself? Jennifer stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her hands were shaking as she clenched her fists by her sides. The weight of Jon's words pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. She slapped him. The sound of the slap echoed in the silence of the room, a sharp, painful noise that left Jennifer breathless. Jon recoiled, his face turning red, a mixture of shock and pain flashing across his features. But Jennifer didn't feel any satisfaction from the slap. She felt numb. Empty. You're a monster, she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. How could you even think of doing this to me? How could you offer me to those men? Jon's eyes welled with tears as he looked up at her, his expression one of pure remorse. Jen, I didn't want this. You have to understand. If we don't do this, they'll kill us. They'll come after us. I don't know what else to do. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Jennifer's knees buckled, and she collapsed back into her chair, feeling the weight of his words crushing her. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make the world stop spinning. But the reality of their situation was undeniable. Anthony's men weren't people you could say no to. They weren't the kind of people who left options open for negotiation. Jon had made a deal, and now Jennifer had no choice but to live with the consequences. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the man she had once loved. The man who had promised to protect her. The man who had now betrayed her in the worst way possible. She didn't know how to reconcile the man sitting before her with the man she had married, the man she had trusted with her life. But there was no time for questions. No time for regret. They were out of options. Jennifer stood up slowly, her mind racing, her heart breaking. She felt as if she were being pulled in 1,000 directions at once, all of them leading her toward an uncertain, terrifying future. Where do we go from here? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jon didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed his eyes, his hands still trembling. Jen, I don't know. But I promise you, I'll make this right. I'll protect you. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Just trust me. But Jennifer couldn't trust him anymore. Not after what he had done. And that night, as the darkness fell over the house, Jennifer whispered the words she never thought she would say. I'll do it. Jon exhaled in relief, as if a weight had been lifted off his chest. But Jennifer knew the truth. She wasn't doing this for him. She wasn't doing it to save him. She was doing it to survive. She had no choice. The nightmare had only just begun. It was 9 p.m. when the deal was made. Jennifer had barely slept the night before, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts, of confusion, of terror. But when the men arrived, that whirlwind quieted into a deep, cold resolve. She had made her decision, but she still couldn't quite believe what was happening. How had her life once filled with love and hope come to this? How had Jon's gambling, his lies, and Anthony's threat led them to this moment, this point of no return? The doorbell rang, and Jennifer's heart skipped a beat. Jon didn't even answer it. He stood by the door, a few feet away from her, but he might as well have been miles away. His eyes were averted, his face pale with guilt. Jennifer wanted to scream at him, to demand to know how he could have dragged them into this nightmare, but she said nothing. She knew there was no point. His silence said it all. He knew exactly what was coming. And for Jennifer, that was the final betrayal, the realization that she had become a pawn in his game, with no way out. Anthony entered first, his presence looming. There was something unsettling about him, something cold, calculating, like a predator circling its prey. His dark eyes swept over Jennifer, but they didn't see her as a person. To him, she was just an object, another step in a twisted game of survival. Behind him came 4 others, men she had never seen before, but men whose malicious grins made her stomach twist in dread. They were all there, standing in her living room, smirking, their eyes trained on her, each one waiting for the moment she would fulfill her part of the deal. Jon stood by the door, his shoulders slumped, unable to meet her eyes. Jennifer could feel the weight of his guilt pressing down on her. He had sold her out, and now she had to face the consequences. He had promised her that they would get through this together, that they would find a way out, but he had broken that promise. Jennifer wasn't sure if she could ever forgive him for this. Anthony glanced at Jon before turning his gaze back to Jennifer, his voice low and mocking. "So, you made up your mind," he said, his words like ice as they cut through the silence. Jon nodded, not a word escaping his lips. Jennifer clenched her fists, trying to ignore the rage that simmered inside her. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from the disgust she felt toward him, the man she had once loved, the man who had now handed her over to these monsters. Anthony smiled, though there was nothing kind in it. He motioned to the men behind him, who laughed cruelly, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Let's not waste time," Anthony said, his tone dripping with amusement as if the whole situation were some sick game. The men laughed again, and Jennifer felt bile rise in her throat. She fought to keep her composure, to hold on to her sense of self. She wouldn't let them see her fear. She refused to let them see the tears that threatened to fall, the shame that burned in her chest. No, she wasn't afraid anymore. She was done being afraid. She would survive this, even if it meant losing everything. Anthony took off his jacket, the gesture as casual as if he were at a dinner party. It only served to make Jennifer's blood run colder. He was so confident, so sure of himself. He hadn't even considered that she might be planning something. But Jennifer knew better. She wasn't just going to let this happen. Not after everything they had done to her. Not after everything Jon had done. "Lead the way," Anthony said, his voice cold and authoritative. Jennifer didn't move. She couldn't. She had already made her decision, but that didn't mean it was easy. The weight of what she was about to do crashed down on her, and for a brief moment, she wondered if she could go through with it. But no, there was no other choice. She couldn't let them win. Anthony's gaze sharpened. "You agreed to this, didn't you?" he asked, his voice filled with expectation. Jennifer exhaled sharply, the air thick with tension, then turned. Her legs felt like lead as she walked toward the bedroom. Her hands shook, but her mind was clear. She wasn't doing this for Jon, not anymore. She was doing it for herself. To survive. To take back some sense of control, to reclaim her life. She stepped into the bedroom, the door closing quietly behind her. The moment the door clicked shut, the world seemed to slow down. Jennifer's pulse thundered in her ears, but she had no time for fear. It had already been replaced with something far stronger. Fury. Desperation. The need to survive. She reached for the hidden knife she had kept under the mattress, the same one Jon had used to cut his own path to ruin, but now it was her weapon, her means of escape. Her fingers wrapped around the handle, the cold steel sending a surge of adrenaline through her body. The power in her grip, the weight of it in her palm, reminded her of the one thing she still had: control. Her breath quickened, her body tense. She could hear Anthony's voice from the other room, laughing, the sound of the men shifting around as they prepared for whatever twisted game they thought they were playing. They didn't know what she was capable of. They didn't know what she had been pushed to. Jennifer took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had no more room for hesitation. No more time to doubt. This was it. She stepped back to the door, her heart beat loud in her chest. She could feel the men's presence, just beyond the threshold, as if they were waiting for something. Waiting for her to obey. But Jennifer wasn't about to let them dictate her fate. With a swift, calculated motion, she swung the door open and faced them. The surprise in Anthony's eyes lasted only a moment, a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity. Before he could speak, Jennifer was already moving. The knife flashed in her hand, a blur of motion. She struck first, her arm driven by instinct and rage. The blade sank deep into Anthony's stomach, and blood splattered across the walls. He gasped, stumbling back, clutching at his wound. But Jennifer wasn't finished. No, she couldn't stop now. She couldn't let him survive this. Not after what he had done. "Why you?" Anthony gasped, the words barely escaping his lips. But Jennifer didn't let him finish. She was already on him, spinning around, targeting the next man in her path. Her hands moved with precision, driven by the fury that had built up inside her. She couldn't stop. Not until every last one of them had paid for what they had done. One by one, she struck, each motion faster than the last, driven by pure survival. There was no hesitation now, no fear. There was only the will to end this, to fight back against the men who had reduced her life to a living hell. By the time she was done, the room was silent. Blood soaked the carpet, the walls, her clothes. The men, 6 of them, were all on the floor, lifeless. Jennifer stood in the center of the chaos, her chest heaving, her hands covered in blood. Her mind was numb, the reality of what she had just done beginning to sink in. But she didn't have time to process it. She didn't have time to think about what had just happened. There was no time for regret. There was only the sound of the phone in her hand. The one she needed to dial. She stepped over the bodies, her breath shaky but determined. With her bloodied hands, she reached for the phone. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice crackled through the line. Jennifer's voice was calm, almost distant, as she spoke the words that would seal her fate. I killed them. And with that, her story was just beginning. When the police arrived, They found Jennifer exactly where she had been when the chaos ended, sitting on the kitchen floor. The room was eerily quiet now, the silence thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Her clothes were stained with blood, and her hands were still covered in it, the knife that had been used in the brutal attack lying cold and lifeless beside her. Jennifer didn't try to flee. She didn't even make a move to stand. She simply waited. Her body was rigid, but her mind was eerily calm. There were no screams, no panic. She didn't cry out for help. She just sat there, as if she had already accepted what had happened, what had to happen. The officers entered cautiously, unsure of what they were walking into. But Jennifer didn't pose any threat. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes empty. They arrested her without incident. No fight, no resistance. She allowed them to cuff her, the metal biting into her wrists as though it were a natural extension of what had already been done. As they led her out of the house, the scene behind her was one of horror. 6 bodies, 6 men lay sprawled across the floor of the bedroom, victims of her fury and fear. But Jennifer wasn't a killer, not in the way the world would see her. She wasn't a cold-blooded murderer. She had been pushed into this corner. And now, the corner had a price. She was about to pay it. Hours later, Jennifer found herself sitting in an interrogation room, under the harsh, fluorescent lights that seemed to make everything feel surreal. The room was small, sterile, cold. She sat at the table, her hands folded in front of her, as if waiting for something to happen. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was clear. The adrenaline that had once surged through her had long since worn off, leaving behind a hollow emptiness that she didn't know how to fill. The 2 detectives sat across from her, their faces a mix of curiosity and wariness. They had seen violence before, but this was different. It wasn't just a simple murder. There were too many questions, too many layers to this story. Why did she do it? How could a woman who appeared so calm, so composed, commit such a brutal act? Detective Ross, a seasoned officer, leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. His voice was steady but laced with a hint of disbelief as he addressed Jennifer. "Jennifer, can you walk us through what happened tonight?" he asked, his gaze intense, as though he were searching for anything that might explain the chaos. Jennifer's eyes met his, but there was no fear in them, only resignation. Her lips parted, and she spoke in a voice that was disturbingly calm. There was no panic, no frantic need to explain herself. She simply began to speak. "It started with Jon," she said, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of the truth. She paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words. He was a gambler. He made promises to me, promises that we would have a life together. But those promises didn't mean anything. They were just words, lies." She paused again, and for a split second, Jennifer's face softened just a hint of vulnerability, a momentary crack in her otherwise emotionless facade. But it was quickly gone, buried beneath the hardened shell that had taken over her. "Jon owed money. A lot of money," she continued, her voice unwavering. "But it wasn't just money. It was his life. Our lives. And when he couldn't pay, they came for us. Her voice faltered for a split second, but she caught herself and took a deep breath before continuing, "They came for me." The detectives exchanged a quick glance, their expressions unreadable. They had heard rumors about Jon's gambling debts, about the dangerous people he had gotten involved with. But this was something entirely different. Jennifer's gaze remained fixed on the table in front of her as she recounted the details of that night, the night her world had crumbled. "Anthony Romano," she said, her voice cool as she spoke his name. "He was the one who came to collect. And when I realized what he wanted from me, what Jon had agreed to, I felt trapped. There was no way out. I couldn't run. I couldn't hide." The detectives leaned in slightly, their interest piqued. "What did he want from you?" Detective Ross asked, his tone shifting slightly, now tinged with something akin to empathy. He had seen cases like this before. He knew that sometimes, people did things out of desperation, things they would never have imagined. Jennifer's lips tightened. She could still hear Anthony's voice in her head, the way he had spoken to her like she was nothing. She could still feel the weight of that moment, the betrayal of her own husband. She swallowed hard before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "Me," she said simply. "He wanted me. My body. And if I didn't do what they wanted, Jon and I both would have been dead." The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with the tension of her words. The detective said nothing for a moment, letting the weight of her confession settle in. They had expected a different story, maybe a tale of rage or jealousy. But this was survival. Jennifer continued, her voice never wavering. "Jon didn't care. He told me to do it. To save us. He didn't love me anymore. He loved himself. He loved the idea of survival, no matter the cost." She paused, the finality of her statement hanging in the air. "I wasn't doing this for him. I wasn't doing this for anyone but me." There was a long silence in the room as Jennifer sat back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the detectives. She had said everything she needed to say. And now, all she could do was wait for their judgment. She didn't feel relief. She didn't feel regret. There was only numbness, the cold emptiness of a life she could never go back to. And as the detectives processed her words, Jennifer knew that whatever happened next, whether she would face charges, or whether she would be found guilty, didn't matter. Because nothing could change the fact that her life had already been destroyed. Nothing could change the fact that she had already made her choice. Jennifer's trial became legendary. The courtroom was packed every day. Reporters filled the benches, eager to document every twist and turn of what the media had already dubbed the betrayal slaughter. Outside, protesters gathered, some calling for justice, others demanding her freedom. The nation was divided. Some saw her as a cold-blooded murderer. Others saw her as a victim who had been pushed beyond her breaking point. The prosecution wasted no time painting Jennifer as a calculating killer. They called her actions a massacre, describing in brutal detail how she had taken the lives of 6 men, including her own husband. She had other options, the prosecutor told the jury. She could have called the police. She could have run. But instead, she chose bloodshed. Jennifer sat in silence as the words were thrown at her. She had expected this. She knew how they would portray her. To them, she was nothing more than a WOM. Jennifer sat in silence as the words were thrown at her. She had expected this. She knew how they would portray her. To them, she was nothing more than a woman who had snapped, a woman who had taken justice into her own hands and left behind a bloodbath. But the defense had a different story to tell. They called Jennifer a survivor, a woman who had been sold by the man she trusted, violated by the men he owed, and finally, cornered with no way out. She was a prisoner in her own home, her lawyer said. Jennifer Hayes did not act out of malice. She acted out of desperation. She acted to save herself. The courtroom was shown everything Jon's messages with Anthony, proving that he had indeed made the deal. Jennifer's bruises. The medical reports. The 911 call where she had turned herself in immediately instead of running. The jury deliberated for days. The world waited. And then, finally, the verdict was read. The courtroom fell into silence as the judge, an older man with weary eyes, cleared his throat. The weight of the moment was unbearable. He looked Jennifer directly in the eye before speaking. "Judge. In the case of Jennifer Hayes, we find the defendant guilty of voluntary manslaughter." A hush fell over the courtroom. The reporters scribbled furiously, the audience whispered in shock, but Jennifer simply sat still. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Some gasped. Others nodded, murmuring that justice had been served. Jennifer expected nothing less. But as the guards approached, securing her handcuffs, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Jennifer's story is one of love, betrayal, and revenge. It began like so many others, two people in love, full of hope, ready to build a life together. Jennifer had trusted Jon. She had believed in him. She had built her world around him. But love, as she learned too late, was not always enough. Jon's gambling addiction had slowly eaten away at their lives, turning their home into a place of fear and uncertainty. At first, it was just numbers on a screen, a few bad bets. But when the debts grew too large, when the wrong people came knocking, Jon made a choice. He didn't choose to protect his wife. He didn't choose to fight for their future. He chose to sell her. And that was the moment Jennifer Hayes' world shattered. She had given him everything: her love, her loyalty, her trust. But Jon had given her away as if she were nothing. What happened next was an act of pure survival. She had been cornered, trapped, betrayed. There was no one coming to save her. She could either accept her fate or take control of it. She chose the latter. Was she a cold-blooded killer? The prosecution said yes. They called her a murderer, a woman who had committed a massacre instead of looking for another way out. They painted her as someone who had lost control, who had chosen violence when she didn't have to. Or was she simply a woman fighting back? The defense argued that Jennifer was a victim first, a woman who had suffered one betrayal too many. A woman who had been put in an impossible situation, forced into something she never agreed to, backed into a corner where violence was the only way out. Her story ignited debates across the country. Some people believed she deserved to be locked away. They believed that no matter the circumstances, murder was murder. That she should have found another way. Others saw her as a tragic figure, a woman who had been forced into an unthinkable choice. Who had endured something no person should ever have to endure. Who had been pushed past her breaking point by the very people who were supposed to protect her. In the end, the jury's decision was final. Jennifer would spend 35 years in prison for what she had done. But as she was led away, handcuffed, surrounded by flashing cameras and shouting reporters, Jennifer did not cry. She did not beg for forgiveness. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Because now, the world finally knew the truth. And now, the question is yours to answer. Was Jennifer Hayes a monster? Or was she just a woman who fought back? You decide. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and comment. What would you have done in Jennifer Hayes' situation? Let us know your thoughts, and stay tuned for more stories of love, betrayal, and the human spirit.